Welcome to our second keynote of this exciting conference, Reimagining Europe from the Peripheries. The first keynote was stunning, a tough act to follow. It takes a great mind to accept this challenge, and here we are. My wonderful colleague Corey Garibaldi, who will handle the Q&A, has given me generously the privilege to introduce our second keynote speaker, Professor Werner Sollors. First of all, welcome, Werner. Thank you so much for being with us. Willkommen in Notre Dame. It is an honor for us. Let me explain why it is an honor. Werner Sollors earned his doctorate from the Freie Universität Berlin and is Henry B. and Anne M. Cabot Professor of English Literature, Emeritus at Harvard University. At Harvard, he taught American, African American, and comparative literature for more than 3 decades and served as chair of Afro-American Studies, History of American Civilization, and Ethnic Studies. He has also taught at Columbia University, at the Università degli Studi di Venezia, and at New York University, Abu Dhabi. Professor Sollors has a lot to say and a life that connects him to many centers and peripheries. In a beautiful interview with Arvind Rajagopal, he said about his life, birth and origins are quite complicated because I was born in Schlesien, I don't know how to pronounce the English version of that, a part of Germany that's now Poland. My mother was a refugee with me when my father was in American captivity as a German soldier in Italy. And my parents didn't know where the other one was for a good year after the end of the war. So I grew up, and my first instinct is that the Frankfurt area was my home. But it was not my birthplace, and my parents constantly reminded me of that also by their inability to read the Frankfurt topography the way I learned to read it, or to speak in Hessen dialect, whatever it is in English, when they knew Silesian dialect. So there was a very quick rupture there. End of quote. There is so much to learn from Werner's life and work about decentering peripheries. If we were to organize a conference on reimagining America from the peripheries, Werner Sollors could be our keynote speaker again. Professor Sollors has contributed so much to our understanding of the world through books such as Beyond Ethnicity, Neither Black Nor White Yet Both, Ethnic Modernism, The Temptation of Despair, Schrift in bildender Kunst, and most recently, Un Bambino a Bergen-Belsen, Ein Kind in Bergen-Belsen. He has edited numerous studies and literary works. He's the recipient of fellowships from the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. He received many awards, including the Constance Rourke Award for the Best Essay in American Quarterly, the Everett Mendelsohn Excellence in Mentoring Award at Harvard, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society for the Study of Multi-Ethnic Literature of the United States, 2 awards from the Charles Chestnut Association, 2 W.E.B. Du Bois medals from the B.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard, and honorary doctorates from the University of Regensburg. Pope Benedict used to teach there, so he's in good company, and the West University Timisoara. A corresponding member of the Austrian Academy of Sciences, and an honorary member of the Bayerische Amerika-Akademie. He's also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the Academia Europaea. And here he is, a citizen of the world in South Bend, Indiana. Werner Sollors' keynote is entitled Goethe and Black America. In the United States, one might feel tempted to answer the question, who was Goethe again? But I will leave that to you. A warm welcome for Professor Sollors.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for this wonderful introduction. I also, of course, have to thank Corey, who cooked up this whole idea for me to come, Francisco and Perrin, and most especially to Becca Prince, who made it all possible. So let me get started right away. Let me set my timer. I have an alarm at some point because I'm one of those people who could talk for hours, so I don't want that to happen. Let me see, here we are, start. Okay. Actually, I was preparing for 4 minutes past the hour opening because it seemed, but we actually started almost on time today. At Harvard, classes start 7 minutes after the hour, which means if you as professor are not there, students have a right to leave without any penalization. And the first time I went to a Muslim country, which was Turkey, the muezzin started at 7 minutes past 5 o'clock. So I thought it's just like Harvard, only I didn't realize that, of course, it changes every day. So I think we're following more the muezzin principle here. So American literature had its beginning in Goethe. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe is the quoted source of the first American novel, William Hill Brown's 1789 Power of Sympathy, with a suicide plot that explicitly takes its cue from Goethe. The hero dies of the pistol shot he directed at himself, and the novel ends with the sorrows of young Werther was found lying by its side. So Goethe, most especially the Goethe of Werther, Wilhelm Meister, and Faust, of poems, maxims, and biographical anecdotes, has enjoyed tremendous popularity in America. America's cookbook Bible, The Joy of Cooking, opened with a motto from Faust applied to recipes: that which thy fathers have bequeathed to thee, earn it anew, if thou wouldst possess it. Goethe's reception in America, therefore, is a vast topic that has been treated expertly by many, many scholars, and I have set myself the task to explore only African-American responses to Goethe, a topic about which I did not find any monograph or even essay-length study in print. So I'm presenting some preliminary findings in the hope that they might prove fruitful for future research, or just for some questions that I can probably only imply rather than even raise. Goethe took only a mild interest in American literature. He, in one brief comment, preferred Cooper over Irving. That was based on a French review of early American fiction he had read. At the ending of his Bildungsroman, the original Bildungsroman Wilhelm Meister, an emigration plot to America was to follow that Goethe chose never to write up. And one of his famous poems opens with the line, Amerika, du hast es besser, America, you have it better, though scholars have told us that what he must have meant was to praise the absence of volcanic basalt in the New World. That we always wanted, altes and basaltes, that rhymes. It's the absence of basalt that makes America the continent that has it better, fewer volcanic eruptions in America. However, Goethe did engage with a popular English work about enslavement and a French novella about an African woman in aristocratic France at the time of the French and Haitian revolutions. And I don't have to say Goethe was deeply interested in the French Revolution, ultimately disappointed, and also, of course, a lifelong lover of Italy. And there's no reaction to the United States that resembles any of his reactions to those two countries and situations. When he was 17, he drafted a tragedy inspired by the Spectator's Inkel and Yariko, a sentimental tale of the indigenous woman Yariko, who was sold into slavery by the heartless English accountant Inkel. They had become lovers. She rescued him on her island, but he felt that he had wasted valuable time with her. Time is money for an accountant. And so he sold her to a Barbados slave trader to make up for his perceived financial loss. And when she tells him that she expects his child, he doubles the price for her. It became a popular tale in the anti-slavery movement, and you see many illustrations accompanied it too. And in his play, Goethe imagined the further fate of enslaved Yariko and her daughter, as well as of Inkel, who repents, always a big topic for Goethe. How do you get out of a terrible guilt that you have accumulated, a repentance scene? So he gets the thing actually to a happy ending. And this was early in his life. He was 17 when he wrote this sequel to Inkel and Yariko. And late in his life, in 1827, Goethe reacted to Claire de Duras' popular novella, Ulrika, about a young Senegalese woman who is saved from enslavement and given as a gift to a French countess who adopts and educates her. The book is mostly told from Ulrika's point of view, making it one of the first literary works with a black woman as the center of consciousness. Goethe commented on Ulrika's, quote, conflict in which the free-born spirit with a heart guessing in all directions finds itself in a restrictive environment with counteractions pressing from all sides. The contrast that the creator wanted struggles to unite, to balance out, and as a result, a loving, love-deserving being goes under. And in an 1829 conversation with Eckermann, Goethe commented on the African slave trade in America, primarily with a critique of English hypocrisy about the rhetoric of ending it. Goethe did meet the anti-slavery activist Abbé Henri Grégoire in August 1805 in the Cathedral of Magdeburg. Grégoire was collecting testimonies of black achievement around the world in order to support the abolition of slavery. So he had the idea one has to collect great works and also just any works by people of African origin. So it's tempting to imagine a dialogue between the intellectual precursor of black studies and the propagator of world literature in the cathedral that was the home to the now famous statue of Saint Maurice, represented as an African. The Holy Roman Emperor had decreed that in the circle around Halle, Magdeburg, all St. Moritz figures would be represented as Africans, and so that took place for about 100 years. There's a wonderful volume in the image of the black in Western art about that figure. Grégoire's major work, De la littérature de nègre, arrived in the Weimar Library, and Goethe's turn toward world literature came to full fruition when he engaged with Persian and Near Eastern writers in his Westöstlicher Divan. Goethe's interest seems not to have been aroused by writings Grégoire discussed, from the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley and the autobiography of Olaudah Equiano, Gustavus Vassa, to the Latin dissertation of the West African Anton Wilhelm Amo, which he had defended in Wittenberg, not very far from where Goethe and Grégoire had met. I always think it would be up for a writer to simply write a chapter about Goethe and Grégoire in Magdeburg Cathedral. They actually didn't talk to each other at that moment. They later on had a dinner, but we don't know what they were talking about there. Anyway, now I get to my real subject, Goethe in Black America, and we're starting with newspapers. Goethe's name was ubiquitous in African-American newspapers from the mid-19th century on. In the 1850s, Frederick Douglass's paper carried several items by and about Goethe, among them an English translation of the poem Haste Not, Rest Not, and a maxim from Wilhelm Meister: when we take people merely as they are, we make them worse. When we treat them as if they were what they should be, we improve them as far as they can be improved. Another maxim had the heading Energy, and you see it, defines it as invincible determination, an honest purpose once fixed, and then death or victory. That quality will do anything that can be done in the world, and no talent, no circumstances, no opportunity will make a two-legged creature a man without it. So the idea already of Bildung, a transformation of a two-legged creature into a man, here through energy, invincible determination. And in several issues of Douglass's paper, Goethe's supposed last words, mehr Licht, I grew up in Frankfurt, mehr Licht so schlecht is what the Hessian interpretation always was, only he didn't get around to the last phrase. Let the light enter is the English translation, very high tone. Frederick Douglass also had a very intimate relationship with his German translator who stayed in his house with him in Rochester, Ottilia Assing, a radical of 48, and they read Goethe together as the collective biography of her and Douglass by Maria Dietrich has demonstrated. In the 20th century, what was proudly called the Negro press included many references to Goethe. Goethe's last words were again highlighted in the Philadelphia Tribune. The Atlanta Daily World applied a quote from Faust to encourage prisoners not to wait until the end of their prison terms but to start reforming immediately. And with Goethe, seize this very minute, what you can do or think you can, begin it. The New Journal and Guide invoked the maxim also that we just had, treat people as if they were what they ought to be, here in the context of the training of black soldiers. The Chicago Defender invoked another passage from Wilhelm Meister, and that's, I think, on the left. Life is a quarry out of which you are to mold and chisel and complete a character. All these little fragments of the idea of Bildung. The Chicago Defender also viewed Goethe's relationship with Schiller as a possible model for how Du Bois and Washington, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington might interact. Schiller may have said of Goethe, he's a glacier, which Washington might also think about Du Bois, and Goethe of Schiller, he destroys what I toiled to create, summarizing Du Bois's opinion of Washington. But for each pair, it was true that both of them were needed. And Joel Rogers had a lifelong project of showing the genetic combination of Europeans and Africans, and especially the African origins of so many Europeans. Beethoven was black, and so he pointed out in an article in the Pittsburgh Courier that there were 3 Moors, German for Negro, in Goethe's genealogy. So enough said, Goethe had Moorish ancestry, was his argument. And an untypical example is Goethe's birthday in the Chicago Defender. In August 1818, Goethe went to Karlsbad for the cure under the care of Dr. Rehbein. One morning, he drank glass after glass of red wine, nearly emptying 2 bottles. When the doctor arrived, Goethe asked him, "Do you know it's my birthday?" "No," said the doctor, "it's not your birthday, it's tomorrow." When Goethe realized his mistake, he said, "Then I've got drunk for nothing." So from snippets of general wisdom to be culled from Goethe's saying to humorous anecdotes, such items in the black press quietly claimed participation in a world beyond slavery for Douglass, racial segregation, lynching, and prejudice in America. And now we get to invocations of Goethe by African-American writers and intellectuals. Charles Chesnutt was the first major African-American short story writer and novelist who tried and failed to make a good living as a writer at the end of the 19th century. His short story, Baxter's Procrustes, satirizes a Cleveland literary club's taste for, quote, personal mementos of distinguished authors, among them a paperweight which once belonged to Goethe, a lead pencil used by Emerson, and so forth. You get the gist. So reading Faust in German in 1880, Chesnutt was struck by the familiarity and flippancy of Mephistopheles in his conversation with the Lord. His teacher, a young German Jewish immigrant, explained that Goethe himself was an unbeliever with little regard for sacred things. When Chesnutt turned to the part of the plot, quote, where the Lord gives the devil permission to lead Faust astray, he found that it is, quote, borrowed, adapted, plagiarized, or paraphrased from the same incident in the story of Job, where the Lord gives the devil permission to tempt Job. The subsequent plan of the story, however, is widely different, for Job maintained his integrity, while Faust fell an easy prey to Mephistopheles. Chesnutt modestly continued, but I must read more before I criticize further. He was a young man at the time, and he paid his tutor to learn German and read Faust in German with him. Alain Locke, now a major figure, studied at Oxford and Berlin, received a PhD in philosophy at Harvard in 1918, the first African-American to do so, and later became professor of philosophy at Howard University. He's best known for his Harlem Renaissance Manifesto, his 1925 book, The New Negro, and Negro was still a term of pride, and new Negroes were African Americans born after the end of slavery. In 1907, Locke, then a senior at Harvard, was chosen as a Rhodes Scholar. The selection of a Negro raised a storm of indignation among board members. Pressure was exerted on the foundation and on Oxford to rescind the scholarship, yet Locke was admitted to Oxford's Hertford College, and it's a sign of the seriousness of the racial issue that no second black student was chosen as a Rhodes Scholar until 1963. So he was the first in 1907, the second 1963. In 1910, Locke wrote an essay on the Rhodes Scholar question, the title an ironic essay, allusion to what's called the Negro question, in which he criticized hasty and premature judgment about the individual because of the nation and the group to which he belongs. Wonderful thing to keep in mind. Locke affirmed that the primary aim of the Rhodes request and ended with an invocation of a Goethean maxim: if once more it should prove impossible for nations to understand one another as nations, then, as Goethe said, they must learn to tolerate each other as individuals. In a college essay Locke had already written, we find the pages of Goethe teeming with the problems of humanity. The realities of life were the sources of his poetry. He flings himself into the whirlpool of the world's thought and leaves in Faust a symbol of the struggle. Goethe's Faust, if it have meaning beyond that of pure literature, is the expression of a philosophy of life which has as its ideal the rising of man through service to his fellow men. Whoever strives unceasingly is not beyond redemption, quoting the end of Faust 2. When Locke traveled to Italy in 1909, he wrote his mother, Goethe took his Werther and his whole army of sentiments over the Alps with the famous song of his life, Kennst du das Land? Do you know the land where the lemons bloom? And everybody knows it, and obviously he counted on his mother also knowing how the song would go on, because he doesn't give the end of Mignon's song in that quick quotation. He wrote weekly and sometimes twice a week letters to his mother throughout her life, so we have a very good record of him. And his biographer, Jeffrey Stewart, wrote that Locke wanted to work out in his writings about European culture his relationship to the burning issues of his society. He was drawn, Stewart says, to the Prometheus myth that Goethe had treated because it, quote, symbolized a powerful interpretation of his emerging role to be the thief who stole the tools of European culture to liberate a darker humanity. It also empowered Locke to believe that he could be the modern-day Prometheus if he could create a new synthesis of black and white conflict in America. Now, inspired by a Harvard class with a very conservative professor, Locke began to synthesize his universal notions and the professor's nationalistic conceptions of cultural production, and see the potential of artists being both representatives of a transnational movement, such as Romanticism, and a national zeitgeist, such as Negro American culture. So a writer can be both a romantic and become a conscious Negro American artist. It was this nucleus of thought that gave rise to the notion of an American cultural pluralism, a term that Locke was involved in coining. In the Ethics of Culture, Locke found the notion compatible with Goethe's idea of a world literature, an inspired metaphorical flash in the solitary mind of Goethe, that phrase about civilizations being a fugue in which voice by voice the several nations and people took up and carried the interwoven theme. Zora Neale Hurston, now the best-known black woman writer of the first half of the 20th century, asserted in a 1928 essay, "I'm not tragically colored, I'm too busy sharpening my oyster knife," her characteristic spunk. And Ernest Mitchell has pointed out that she alludes to the ending of Faust 2. At certain times, I have no race, I am me, the cosmic Zora emerges, I belong to no race nor time. I am the eternal feminine with its string of beads, you know. So she puts a joke onto the ending of the chorus, Mysticus in Faust 2, das ewig weibliche zieht uns hinan, by applying it to herself. And now a few poets. Robert Hayden's poem, Eine kleine Nachtmusik, set in post-war Vienna, published in 1948. Now as skin and bones Europe hurts all over from the swastikas, Hexentanz. Oh, think of Anton, Anton Brittel, Anton Crystalline. And Giovanna Micconi has shown that the metaphor of the swastikas, Hexentanz, evokes the Walpurgisnacht in Faust in dealing with the legacy of the Nazis and also the world of the occupation in Vienna. And she argues that Anton could be interpreted as a modern version of Faust himself. Melvin B. Tolson, another modernist poet, wrote in the Republic of Liberia. He was a poet laureate of the Republic of Liberia. To the dark continent, you are the lightning rod of Europe, Canaan's key, the rope across the abyss, mehr Licht for the Africa to be. Timothy de Jong argued that by using the final utterance of one of the great thinkers of the Western literary tradition, Tolson synthesizes Africa and the West. So we see how much effort goes into the idea of a synthesis. The culmination of the idea of a synthesis was the 1949 bicentennial of Goethe's birth, celebrated in Aspen, Colorado, which was a nothing place at the time and became, it's true, it became a ski resort and a music place because of the Goethe bicentennial in 1949. This was the embodiment of the idea of a synthesis in the name of universal values. For the African-American press, it was important that the bicentennial was not only international, but also interracial, key words of the 1940s. And Black participation in this bicentennial was therefore crucial. I thought it was telling that the New Journal and Guide report mentions Black soprano Dorothy Maynor before Arthur Rubinstein, Jose Ortega y Gasset, and Albert Schweitzer as participants in this. Maynor's repertoire included, I gave you a little slide, she has many records, spirituals as well as lieder, compositions by Beethoven and Richard Strauss, as well as Black composers Samuel Coleridge Taylor and Cecil Cohen. And Cohen set his lieder to text by African-American poets Countee Cullen and Langston Hughes. Both Albert Schweitzer, who then appeared on the cover of Time accompanying this event, and Dorothy Maynor were invited to stay at the event sponsors. They were cardboard manufacturers, Walter and Elisabeth Pepke, German immigrant cardboard manufacturer, which was a boom business when you had more jiffy bags and packages getting out in cardboard after World War II. And what Elisabeth Pepke said, that Maynor stayed with the sponsors because the Hotel Jerome refused to take her. And Mrs. Pepke continued that culture began helping push back the color barrier in Aspen. In 1952, the Red Onion Bar brought Billie Holiday to sing for 6 nights, and it changed her life. She learned to ski, and Aspen's by putting it on the music map. According to that storyline, the Pepkes saved Maynor from racial insults at the only hotel in town, the segregated Jerome. Yet there are credible reports that the Hotel Jerome was actually owned by the Pepkes at the time, and that they used the bicentennial as a business opportunity, including a renovation of the Hotel Jerome that then became a way to go skiing before all the lodges and the other stuff was built up there, the pseudo-Swiss revival up there. Another Goethe bicentennial took place at Fisk University, as reported in the New Journal and Guide. The host was Arna Bontemps, a Harlem Renaissance participant and Fisk librarian, close friend of Langston Hughes, and author of the 1934 novel about a slave rebellion, Black Thunder. Bontemps, that was, by the way, perhaps the single first African-American novel about slavery published in the United States in 1934. Bontemps' fixed celebration included the Italian anti-fascist Giuseppe Borghese, who had spent the 1930s and the war years in the US in exile, and who was working on a world constitution. He had given the opening lecture at Aspen with a memorable quip that Goethe, not Hitler, was the permanent ambassador of the German community to the community of man. So in 1949, everybody said, oh, Germany. And he said, no, no, it's Goethe, it's not Hitler. That was the thrust of his argument. The third man portrayed in the photograph of the Fisk celebration was Dr. Ferdinand Gova, a German Jewish refugee who served as professor of foreign languages at Fisk for decades and who introduced, very interestingly, quantitative and word frequency approaches to text, as well as remote language learning via television. You see, you thought you had it hard with Zoom. That's how he did the language teaching. That many more students in Nashville could learn German very quickly with his cinematic approach. So three intellectuals were united in segregated Nashville, an Italian anti-fascist dreamer of a world federation, a German Jewish refugee and educational innovator, and an African-American intellectual novelist and archivist. By celebrating Goethe's bicentennial year in an integrationist fashion with the black students together in the same room, they projected to students the sense of a world after the end of fascism and racial segregation. That, by the way, was the motto of the Double Victory campaign that the Pittsburgh Courier had launched during World War II. World War II was for the victory against fascism abroad and against segregation at home. And now we get the first Black American Gretchen, and as far as my researchers go, also the only Black American Gretchen in a professional production in a theater, not a college theater production. It appeared at La Mama in 1978. The production was part of the integrationist movement for colorblind multiracial casting. Fritz Benewitz, the director of the German National Theater in Weimar from 1960 to 1975, good old East German days, directed this Faust at La Mama. Jamil Zakai of Syrian descent played Faust, James Leon Mephisto, Christine Campbell and Marilyn Amaral, both black, were cast as Gretchen and Marthe. The rest was a colorful interracial melange, as David John, in one of the few essays I could find about this production, wrote. Condition for being cast was that one had to be an actor of minority background in New York City who had been unemployed for at least 1 year. And according to Benewitz, 4,000 applied. So it must have been a bad year for minority actors in New York. Casting Gretchen as a black woman stressed the universalism intended by the production, though the emphasis on Campbell's racial background also called renewed attention to racial difference that was needed to make the universal claim more plausible. In order to imagine herself as Margarete, Campbell reports that she went to the cloisters and meditated in front of a statue of St. Margaret. Campbell insisted that the key scene for her were Gretchen's famous lines, "My peace is gone, meine Ruhe ist hin." From that point on, I feel that Goethe wrote pure music. The flow from moment to moment is incredible. Rhythmically, emotionally, the colors that I had to achieve, the images to fulfill and create, truly an actress's dream. It gives me chills, even thinking about it now. My peace is gone, the turning moment of the whole play, where the events move so fast that it's almost as if the characters were carried on a wave, on a tidal wave, to their end. As part of her preparation, she played Lady in Satin, her favorite Billie Holiday album, and continued, almost without thinking, I ran my eyes over lines and passages in Goethe's dramatic text, every word that Billie Holiday sang sounded as if Gretchen was singing. I'm a fool to want you. I'm a fool to want you, to want a love that can't be true. I have the link here. I don't want to just, click Billie Holiday and Lady in Satin and you will find it. But to seek a kiss, not mine alone, to share a kiss the devil has known. So David John says, here the theme central to Faust, betrayed love, collusion with the devil, Gretchen's sadness and desperation, and a breakthrough for Campbell, who finds her way to Gretchen through Billie Holiday. La Mama took the production to Princeton, and it was videotaped. I did a little bit of a wild goose chase to find that videotape. It's not at the Fritz Benowitz archives where it's supposed to be, but there is a very weak copy of it at the La Mama archive, and the archivist there kindly sent me a clip to play for you. In this recording, Christine Campbell performs Gretchen's rapid character transformation in a few stanzas. My piece is gone. Those are the stanzas. At first, she speaks in a young, innocent girl's voice. Then she increasingly expresses her physical torment in voice and body posture. By the time she thinks of Faust, she becomes overwhelmed by her yearning to surrender to his hand and to his kiss. This is indeed Billie Holiday's Kiss the Devil Has Known. This is again David John. And now we will see, maybe you can get us there.
My peace is gone. My heart is sore. Find it never and nevermore. For him I not have, there is my grave. This world is all turned into gall. And my poor mind is quite insane, and my poor head is rent with pain. My peace is gone, my heart is sore. I find it never and nevermore. And for him only I look and go to my window seat. For him only I go out into the street. His lofty gait, his noble eyes, the smile of his mouth, and the force of his eyes. And his words flow, enchanting bliss. The touch of his hand, my heart is sore. I find it never and nevermore. My bosom surges for him alone. Oh, that I could clasp him and hold him so, and kiss him to my heart's content, till in his kisses I were spent.
So African-American echoes in poetry and prose is the next section. Frances Harper is best known for 10 volumes of poems, very popular in the 19th century. The poem Let the Light Enter was first published in an abolitionist weekly, Anglo-African, in 1860, and has the subtitle The Dying Words of Goethe. It's divided into 6 stanzas, in all of which the second and fourth lines rhyme, and the most prominent sound is that surrounding the word light and the rhyme pairs that it dictates with bright and sight in the last 4 stanzas. So the poem could be considered as an extended hovering on or sounding out of the English translation of Mehr Licht. Light, more light, the shadows deepen, and my life is ebbing low through the windows widely open. Light, more light before I go. And the last stanza, gracious Savior, when life's daydreams melt and vanish from the sight. May our dim and longing vision then be blessed with light, more light. And the last stanza, when it originally appeared in the black Anglo-African newspaper, was a little different. It said, "Blessed Jesus, when our daydreams melt." So gracious Savior is more addressed to a general American reading public, and it's not our daydreams only, it's life's daydreams, so it seems to be more inviting to a broader audience. But the original created a deeper religious sense and a stronger community feeling. And Paul Laurence Dunbar, also best known for his poems and an absolute favorite among African American readers, The Haunted Oak from 1900 is a ballad poem based on a talking tree, a common theme, of course, in ballad poetry, but it begins with questions addressed to the tree. Why are you so bare, so bare? And the tree answers. The bough of the oak tree has witnessed a lynching. My leaves were green as the best I trow, and sap ran free in my veins, but I saw in the moonlight dim and weird a guiltless victim's pains. Virginia Jackson noted that there's no redemption or punishment at the end. The haunted oak's bough suffers, but the mob members live on. And Jean Wagner noticed that the mob untypically includes an unusually strong indictment of the participation of the educated classes in the lynching. The local judge, the doctor, the pastor, they are the ones who are wearing the Ku Klux Klan robes and do the lynching. And Wagner was also the first to recognize that one of Dunbar's models was Goethe's poem Erlkönig, with its famous beginning, "Who rides so late through night and wind." It was set to music by Schubert. And again, if you want to click a little bit more, click YouTube for Jesse Norman performing the Schubert version of Erlkönig. And you see Dunbar adapts it. Who is it rides by night over the moonlit road? What is the spur that keeps the pace? What is the galling goad? So the supernatural mode in Goethe's poem has given way in its Black American adaptation to human demons, and at times they carried the name night riders, quite appropriate to this poetic use of Goethe. Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born Harlem Renaissance writer who had read Goethe when he was still in Jamaica, and under the pen name Rhonda Hope, he sent a sonnet, My Werther Days, to an editor in 1916. It was not published until a few years ago by William Maxwell. So this is the manuscript from the Houghton Library of the poem. It's a Petrarchan sonnet, like many of McKay's poems. Starts with a proposition and then with a solution of it. And it offers a somewhat ironic rejection of suicidal thoughts in the manner of Werther. It's ironic because he doesn't believe in God, so there is no afterlife in which anything could occur, so he's not going to kill himself, is the argument. I am not among the favored few, among the weeds my once flowering grove. I wander chanting madrigals of rue. I have not faith to turn mine eyes above the strangely whirling world. I but see through the splintered window of my house of love. And now the last of these writers echoes Charles Johnson, who wrote a short story, The Sorcerer's Apprentice. And if you haven't recently read the poem, you may remember the Fantasia adaptation of it with the brooms becoming independent of the Sorcerer's Apprentice who doesn't control the machinery that he sets loose. Charles Johnson, the philosophical novelist, who's best known for his novel Ox-Herding Tales. Anyone read that? Has a great chapter on Karl Marx coming to the plantation in order to undo the work of a Hegelian tutor who has sort of corrupted the first-person singular narrator. But he wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice, which differs from Goethe's poem because it shows the apprentice Alan Jackson growing into the role of magician but only when he stops imitating. And it becomes clear because the master is left-handed, and so as long as he does it with the left hand, he can't do it. And when he realizes he has to do it his own way with his right hand, because he is right-handed, sorcery becomes natural to him. So I asked Johnson about Goethe and this, and he wrote me, in my story, magic or sorcery is a metaphor for making art. My apprentice is an artist, and he has to learn patience, that art is more than a handful of tricks that he can learn from his teacher, and that art doesn't always come when one wants it to come. Now, another little segment is Goethe as a model for life. Jean Toomer, whose 1923 book, Cain, is considered the highest achievement of Harlem Renaissance writing, greatly admired Wilhelm Meister. He referred to the novel in 1919 at a time when he decided to make writing his life's work, right after reading Wilhelm Meister and receiving a new vision and a new understanding of himself from Goethe. The world that he found he entered through Goethe was the world of the aristocrat, but not the social aristocrat, the aristocrat of culture, of spirit and character, of ideas, of true nobility. I resolved to devote myself to the making of myself such a person as I caught glimpses of in the pages of Wilhelm Meister. I would write. And it's at this moment that he first uses the first name Jean Toomer, also with an androgynous sound. You can't quite, you don't know what is it a man, is it a woman, who is writing like this, and he chooses that as a name. Now, I think the strongest Goethean of African-American writers in the 19th and 20th century is W.B. Du Bois, a major black intellectual who lived for almost a century and who interpreted the condition of being black in America as well as his own educational development through a Goethean lens that he acquired at Fisk, at Harvard, and at the University of Berlin. Two souls, alas, reside within my breast, and either would be severed from the other. This is, Faust's famous lament, zwei Seelen wohnen acht in meiner Brust. And Du Bois draws on this metaphor of self-division in The Souls of Black Folk, one of his most famous books, and that also yielded what is the most frequently quoted line or paragraph in African-American writing. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One always feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls. I mean, it's a literal incorporation of Faust's two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of the strife, the longing to attain a self-conscious manhood, to merge this double self into a better and truer self, and also this question of attaining manhood in the sense of Goethe, becoming a mensch out of the quarry that you make. Du Bois also translated a Goethe a poem, Das Beste, and you see we got it from some calendar on the top, and then he translated it, what better can you hope and have when head and heart are worried, who loves no more and errs no more should let himself be buried. So trying to get the rhyme scheme also very close to the Goethean original. And like Locke had done, he developed the Prometheus theme, and you have a couple of quotation on that, and he took on very explicitly Goethe as a model. Again, this is the Prometheus thing. Some friends sent him a postcard of Rockefeller, and I never knew that statue was actually Prometheus in Rockefeller Center, and told him that he was the modern day Prometheus, an American Prometheus who has stolen the fire from those on high in order to light up the world with a celestial fire of free thought. It's a great postcard to send to someone. Du Bois took on the model of drawing on Faust again and on Wilhelm Meister's apprenticeship and wandering years. He wrote about Atlanta University, that he heard the voice of time, and the voice of time actually is Goethe's voice, which he offers in untranslated German, entbehren sollst du, sollst entbehren. I gave you the English translation in quote, but when you look at the text, it's only the critical editions that have the footnote in it. He just assumed in 1903 any reader would be able to know what that was. More exciting, I found in The Future of Africa, the text of an address to be given in Accra, Ghana in 1958. So Du Bois was in his 90s. Du Bois returned to that quote from Faust, this time with an English translation, and said, great Goethe sang, entbehren sollst du, sollst entbehren, thou shalt forego, shalt do without. If Africa unites, it will be because each part, each nation, each tribe give up a part of its heritage for the good of the whole. That is what union means. That is what Pan-Africanism means. Your local, tribal, much-loved languages must yield to the few world tongues which serve the largest number of people and promote understanding and world literature. This was the speech he ended up not giving because he was ill, but his wife delivered the speech. I would imagine a rather startled audience, hearing this admonition with Goethe from a 90-year-old man. In his autobiography, Du Bois characterized his program at Fisk as the natural demand of youth for light, more light. Fisk was a good college. I liked it, but it was small, and so he went on. Also, when he went to Berlin, he toured Europe. He stayed in Europe for a long time. And he wrote then, looking back at his traveling years, of greatest importance was the opportunity which my Wanderjahre in Europe gave of looking at the world as a man. Here we have again this, now slightly heretical term for the idea of getting out of yourself some Mensch being, and not simply from a narrow racial or provincial outlook. Later he told himself, I must step, walk, stumble, and climb now, for the Lehrjahre were past, I fancied, and the Meisterjahre begun. So Goethe remained a fixed point of reference for Du Bois. Rita Dove has a special relationship to Goethe because she was born on the 28th of August, just like Goethe was, only a couple of centuries and 3 years later. She studied Goethe with, 3 more minutes, with African-American Germanist Marion Musgrave at Miami University in Ohio. Goethe had been what she wanted to become, and her favorite poem was Wanderers Nachtlied, and she looked at different translations of it and then also translated it herself. She wrote, I've given up trying to explain how good it is, and her own translation is, and maybe we can listen to that. If you can click on that, Rita Dove reads it on the pages of the New Yorker. When I click, I always get an ad to subscribe or to renew my subscription to the New Yorker. I hope this will not happen to you. Yeah, there we've got, now you click on the...
Above the Mountaintops by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, 1776, translated from the German. Above the mountaintops, all is still. Among the treetops you can feel barely a breath. Birds in the forest stripped of song. Just wait. Before long, you too shall rest.
All right, let's get back to the, if we can. Can you get us back to the PowerPoint? Okay. Good. Now, the criticism of the West, you've probably been waiting for that. The only criticism I could find was in a debate in Negro Digest, where the criticism Addison Gale wrote that one cannot separate Zola from Napoleon, Goethe from Adolf Hitler, Tolstoy from Joseph Stalin, Henry David Thoreau from Richard Nixon, and so forth. Remember that Borghese at the 49 celebration had said Goethe, not Hitler, was Germany's ambassador, but now for some black critics after the 60s, it was futile to distinguish artists' achievements from their nation's crimes. In Addison Gale's eyes, the West had become Hitler's West. Now there was only Goethe and Hitler, no Goethe without Hitler. And the African writer, South African writer Ezekiel Mfalele, responded with a critique of Gale. And by that time, Negro Digest had become a Black World. Also interesting, the transformation, because the term Negro now was no longer the preferred term. And Mfalele wondered whether if we touch one thing, we are tainted by the whole system. Are Black Americans only going to sing or play Black music? Is Leontine Price not to sing Verdi? Or we might ask Dorothy Maynor not to sing Richard Strauss, or Jesse Norman not to sing Schubert. So this dialogue, as I said, was my only finding of that night. Now I just have a tiny coda and then my conclusion. So silhouettes, I've used them all along, were popular in the age of Goethe. Werther kisses Goethe in a shadow, he kisses her shadow image as a fetish, you know, Lotte's image is so dear to him. And you have Lavater, also interested in different physiognomies, so he has an African among his types. And in America, slave sales could sometimes be accompanied by a shadow profile of the figure for identification purposes. And Moses Williams, who was a slave manumitted in 1802, started working as a silhouette maker with a machine in which he produced 8,000 silhouettes in his first year for the painter Charles Wilson Peale. And Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw has shown that he also did, among these 8,000, his own profile. Peale's sons became portrait painters, but Moses Williams, working in Peale's studio, did only profile. So it seemed like a racialization of the profile was for the ex-slave. The contemporary artist, Kara Walker, found it ironic that so many white people let themselves be portrayed as Black shadow images, and inverted the technique when she created an image on the occasion of Obama's election with a white silhouette on Black background, which she submitted to that New Literary History that I had the pleasure of co-editing. And we asked her, would she want to write anything on Obama's election, which had just happened. And so she sent this in a series of images. Her work in silhouettes accentuates the Black-white contrast and uses enigmatic, sadistic, obscene configurations, also grotesque stereotypes. Here, a courtly lady and gentleman who cook up cutouts of 3 Negro servants and a Jew in this kettle in the middle. And she also deformed a silhouette of Goethe in conversation with Fritz von Stein. She found it on a postcard, but here you see the boy hangs suspended from Goethe's index finger, and she inserted this image into a large theater curtain-sized panorama of slavery. And now just the conclusion. Ortega y Gasset gave a lecture at the Aspen Bicentennial and published a short book, In Search of a Goethe from Within. What my survey of Black American responses has yielded is very much a Goethe from without, or from the periphery, in order to use the language of your conference. For many writers and journalists, maxims by Goethe, ascribed to Goethe, triggered brief engagements. But for some Black American writers, like for others in many parts of the world, Goethe's words provided an invitation for new creativity in poetry, Harper, Dunbar, Mackay, Du Bois, Dove; in prose, Du Bois, Charles Johnson; in performance, Black Gretchen, Jesse Norman; and translation, Du Bois and Dove, even for a whole new orientation of life in some cases, and Toomer. Locke derived from Goethe a way of imagining cultural pluralism in the United States. And perhaps the most Goethean among African Americans was Du Bois, who viewed his own life in Wilhelm Meister's terms and saw in Faust's 2 souls a key to the Black condition. This alone has generated volumes of reflection on Du Bois' notion of double consciousness. Rita Dove and Charles Johnson have most explicitly referred to Goethe in poetry and prose. The number of others who have responded to Goethe is significant enough so that a whole outline of the Black American tradition may appear when seen through the lens of Goethe in Black America. Margaret Alexander, for example, translated Heide Röslein and won an award for that when she was a student. And one motif that Goethe introduced, Goethe in 1771 witnessed the execution of a woman who had killed her own child, an unwed woman who killed her own child in Frankfurt. And Goethe was obsessed by that story, and Gretchen became one of the configurations. His friend from student days, Wagner, wrote a play, Die Kindermörderin, Schiller wrote a poem, Die Kindsmörderin, and of course, Faust, Urfaust to Faust, always had that motif in it, and that went through a long series of transformations until you find it in Harriet Beecher Stowe's The Quadroon Story, and finally in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, the woman who kills her own child. A historical change has also become apparent once Goethe could be invoked as a way of taking part in the common culture from which blacks were often excluded, but references to Goethe could also be adapted to abolishing slavery, protest against lynching, demand an end to segregation, or hail the independence of African countries. Now it is hard to imagine that a black writer would wish Africa mehr Licht, as Tolson did, or admonish leaders in Ghana to surrender their nationalism and their tribal languages to yield to the world languages with Faust's motto, entbehren sollst du entbehren, as Du Bois did. No black woman writer would probably now claim to be the eternal feminine, as Hurston did. But Goethe's aphorisms and works from Werther, Faust, and Wilhelm Meister to many of his poems have circulated widely in Black America. And I already mentioned that Mignon song must have been something that even Locke's mother must have known. But in all my searches and roaming around Goethe in Black America, I have, perhaps for understandable reasons, found no single Black American reaction to, comment on, or even partial quotation of Goethe's lines beginning with Amerika, du hast es besser.
Am I unmuted? Okay. So would you like to stand or sit? Do you have a preference?
Yeah.
Okay.
I forgot my water.
All right. Is this unopened? Oh, there, here you go.
So Abby is going to help with directing questions. And does anyone want to start?
I'm curious if in this review of Goethe's attitude toward Africans, there was something what we would today call racial or cultural. I mean, did he see this as something inherent? Black civilization just had something different. Or did he see a common origin for all humans, et cetera, as we probably see it in anthropological terms today?
I don't think he was a sort of Blumenbach, racial diversifier. I think the encounter with the Near Eastern poetry was, I think, one of the real moments where he thought there is a whole mode of expression that exists anywhere in the world, not everywhere. Has he seen it? And he didn't travel much. He never got to Hamburg. He wasn't a world traveler. But he was a curious person who expected to find the possibility of it wherever he looked. I found that there's a wonderful essay by Karl Gutke on Goethe and Africa, which gives you a good sense of the range of reactions he had. When Goethe goes to Italy, a man in Sicily takes him to the shore and says, Africa's over there. And Goethe notices something on the left side. And so that is always taken as, oh, he was not interested in Africa. But Goethe has a big argument. He was very much interested in Africa and had quite a bit of things to say. He was much less interested in America as a, whether the American Revolution or American writing didn't really motivate him all that much. And even the story of the Ausgewanderten, concerned the people who were in the Palatinate, during the French occupation, they had to leave, and now they're going back, and they have conversations about what does it mean to be dislocated and relocated. So I think the weaker spot was rather his lack of interest in America, apart from the absence of basalt. But not in Africa. I don't think there was a Blumenbachian hierarchy.
Thank you very much. That was extremely pleasant and exciting and just wonderful to listen to so much Goethe in an American context. And I wanted to ask you something out of sheer ignorance. Could you contextualize this for me a little bit? Apparently people, well-educated, college-educated people in America read and have read Goethe. Is that part of a larger, what do they know about German literature in general? Does Schiller, does Lessing, what shows up other than Goethe? Or is it just isolated Goethe? And I must say that I am asking in part out of frustration. If you go into a library or into a bookstore these days and look for German literature, you get Goethe and Goethe and Goethe and nothing else. So, and you get Faust and Faust and Faust.
Well, there's this wonderful book by Pockman, German Culture in America, which has the reception quite a bit, went through the transcendentalists in the 19th century, who were open to quite a bit of writing. The German idealists were all big. But even, like Büchner was translated, for example. I think there was quite a, Germany had cultural prestige in the 19th century. So thinking of Bourdieu terms, that was just one currency by which you worked. But also schools would teach, as part of a literary corpus, German literature beyond Goethe. So I think there was a much broader. I think Pochmann is the best. It's 500 pages and big pages. So you have quite a bit of evidence on a very massive reception. Even the histories of American literature that were published at the beginning of the 20th century never translate quotations in German, French, and Latin. So those were the three languages that any reader of an American literary history would be expected to know. So I think it was quite widely disseminated. I think the big markers are, of course, World War I and then World War II. That double whammy, I think, pretty much did German literature in the United States.
I think my question follows on that. Beyond Goethe, when you're reading, was there another German figure or another European figure who stood in something like the same level of interest and passion, or is Goethe a unique figure in African American literature?
I think for the African Americans that was the strongest, but I would have to start a new paper and search for some other names, because there is, as I said, there was no secondary literature to guide me. So now with digital resources, you take the Black newspaper archives, 3 or 4 of them, and you do the name search, and then you get a few references, and then you read around it. So I would have to look for some other likely names. I know that in this neck of the woods, here in Chicago, Kathleen Conzen has worked on the Schiller festivities, and there was always the more radical migrants were leaning toward Schiller, the more bourgeois elements were leaning toward Goethe. Then Heine, for example, had a very big following in New York, in the Bronx. It's one of the once upon a time worst neighborhoods in the Bronx that had this big Heine monument in the middle of it. Said, how did that come about? Well, German immigrants in the South Bronx who built a Heine monument. So I think you had a whole number of big writers who had particular following, and I bet with all of them, you would find some echoes in the black press as well. The mediation often happened through the Negro colleges, as they were then called, historically black institutions, where then also many Europeans, and especially Germans, and after 1933, German Jewish refugees taught, and they transmitted quite a bit of that into the 50s and 60s, in those institutions, often with a very broad knowledge. And they had also gone through the old school where you still memorized all these poems, and so you could easily stand in front of your students at Fisk and just recite, maybe 24 poems. That I think was a different world from today's. Let's look at my YouTube click. So I think that you would find quite a bit of others. But I did not do any searches for other authors. I really limited to Goethe. The origin of this impetus came. There was a workshop in Weimar. I grew up like 300 meters away from Goethe's birthplace in Frankfurt. And the first time in my life I was invited to Weimar was last year, and it was a study group that wanted to explore Goethe and America. And so then I thought that might be interesting to see what has been written about African Americans. And then when I saw there wasn't anything written about that, I picked that as a topic. So that's how it emerged. And when Corey thought this was a good paper to offer in this context, I did actually write a paper out of what were just seminar notes before. So I would have to start from scratch to really give a good and scholarly answer to both of these questions.
Lauren.
Sure, thank you for that talk. I was really struck by the fact that there's a wide range of. Thank you. I was really struck by the fact that there's a really wide range of Goethe's work that's being picked up by these different thinkers, right? We have Wilhelm Meister, we have Faust, we have a really wide range of poetry. Just focusing on Goethe, were there any works of Goethe that seem to have almost no reception in the US or no reception in the African American literary tradition specifically? I guess this is a question about, were you struck by anything from Goethe that clearly didn't translate or wasn't received, works that are major Goethe works that are absent from this corpus?
Yeah, a good question always. What was not there? There was one reference I came across to Dichtung und Wahrheit, Goethe's autobiography, but it wasn't, Goethe also makes the humor columns, like you saw with the getting drunk for nothing example. So it's, the childhood episode where Goethe is alone in the house in Frankfurt, and he has all the dishes, sitting around the sink, and the neighbors across the street, and the houses were built like this, so you could basically shake hands with the neighbors and throw out the dishes. And little Goethe, 6 years old, starts throwing out the dishes and enjoys the noise of the clattering dishes and the neighbors. That appeared in an abolitionist newspaper for some reason, a sort of like infantile anger and destructive, sort of an anarchist mode in that, but nothing else from Dichtung und Wahrheit, which I think is a very interesting book to think of how do you arrive at Bildung in your self-constitution. Also Goethe working out so carefully about the masculine and feminine parts in himself that he is indebted to his mother and his father for that might also resonate today in a very interesting way. Nobody picked that up, for example, in the mixed race authors who were attracted to it. Charles Weldon Johnson, for example, has the character going to a production of the Gounod opera Faust, but that's interested in the relationship of Gretchen and her brother when the protagonist doesn't know that he had a sister until he sits next to her in the Paris Opera. So that's the scene he goes for, not the idea of having something white, something black, something paternal, something maternal. So I think that's missing. Wahlverwandtschaften is not there at all. Also the conversations of the emigres, which would be interesting for all the migrant surroundings. Chestnut's learning Faust from a migrant who teaches him German and reads Faust with him, I think. would be interesting for him to bring up also that. I think it's very much poems, sayings, and then Faust is, of course, packed with the devil, the man, you know. I was surprised that there wasn't a black adaptation of Faust. I mean, so many classical plays have been adapted for, you know, a kind of race reading. Medea, I just saw a London version of Medea with a black Medea, or, you know, she's like half, I forgot, Vietnamese and half something else, so she's a good British actress. But the physicality is emphasized in that production, and there is no black Faust except for that one that you saw, that poor little video clip of. So that, you know, you don't have a full engagement with the entire play through a lens of what would a black perspective get out of the pact with the devil, and also the woman who becomes a child murderer, who's responsible for her brothers. That, yeah, I mean, the Gretchen's tragedy is enormous and would in itself be a wonderful play. Just the Gretchen play would be a fantastic one. So it was really limited to the monologues of Faust, to the general plot outline, and then to a single quip like Zora Neale Hurston, who, you know, one can never take seriously, but, you know, I'm the eternal feminine, ha ha, with a necklace. You know, so I think there's quite a bit. Goethe, of course, was translated, all Goethe's complete works already, second half of the 19th century, easily available, and also easily regurgitated in the reception industry, so that black intellectuals had a double access to it. They didn't have to know German, though Locke knew it, Du Bois knew it, Chestnut knew it, so, and Rita Dove, who is married to a German too, knows it really well. So I think there are quite a few a connection that could have been made that weren't made. I think you could probably easily come up with a long list of predictable works that weren't picked up.
Someone who's better on time, do you know how many minutes we have approximately?
12.
12?
Yeah.
Okay.
You may have mentioned this earlier, but what was the point of origin of your interest in this particular connection between blackness and Goethe?
Well, you want autobiography, scholarship?
So was there a magic moment which led you to contemplate this connection?
Well, now that you ask for it, when I was a kid, Frankfurt was milling with black soldiers, and in front of one of the first buildings that was rebuilt in Frankfurt was the Goethe House. So you had, you know, ruins on the left and ruins on the right, and then there were tours for black soldiers who went to Goethe's house. In fact, Claude McKay, in one of his novels, has a character visiting Goethe's birthplace. So I can come up with a visual memory of black GIs whom I always admired because they had body postures that I had never seen from a German adult. You know, just a form of standing in a relaxed way while seeming to be in attention and in uniform. It seemed just fantastic. And then there was the Goethe thing, which was strong. I went to a Goethe Gymnasium in Frankfurt for 9 years. So, you know, I had that on my, and then there was something about growing up in the American zone with a lot of black presence. So I would say this is my deep autobiographic thing. The intellectual side, I think you probably heard it. I mean, it's a little bit of a polemic. I never like to be too polemical in an overt way. But, you know, where is the sense of reaching out, of finding connections, of finding syntheses, of finding ways to resolve conflicts? We seem to be so much more readily given now to say, you know, this was all the guilt of X, and because of X, everything connected with X should now go into the garbage bin, and is you know, not in any ways necessary for us anymore. And so I found it really eye-opening for me how many black writers struggling. These were all activists. There wasn't a single, you know, sellout among the group who were going for Goethe in order to, you know, get a reward at the end of the year. but to read literature from a completely different place in order to find out something about themselves, find out something about the political condition, find out an idea of a utopia about how things might be different. So I found that refreshing in my own reading, being daily concerned, as you all probably are, with reading about cancel culture and I don't know what, and what you can say in class and what you can't say in class. I always like to say what I wanted to say in class, I should say. So going forward, it sounds like a dusty topic, but in which a lot of intellectuals got a lot of juice out of that dusty topic. That began to fascinate me. So that's, I think, is more the kind of needling side that's underneath that I didn't want to, put into an overt thing. I think those are the two ways I can think. And technically, bureaucratically, it was being in Weimar, where Goethe spent the rest of his life in what was compared to his parents' house, a dump. Goethe's house in Weimar is nothing compared to his father's bourgeois house. His father had a window broken on the side so he could see when his son would come home at night. It was a real respectable building. The Weimar thing with a little annex here looked sort of like a ranch house. Sorry, I'm too snotty about it. But being in Weimar and thinking about Goethe and America and not really having a smoking gun about America was, that was sort of the bureaucratic prompt of saying, gotta do that.
So this goes back to one of the first questions, I hope. So you found a lot more than I expected you would when you asked me about this several months ago. So I have a related question. One, I do think that this is a pattern in terms of sort of intellectual influences on African Americans. As in, if you looked at digital archives, you'd be able to find a host of people who sort of fit a similar pattern if you were as diligent and sustained as your work has modeled. So I think that, in that respect, it's incredibly impressive. And I have my own opinion on this, but I'm curious, do you think that this kind of scholarship changes Black studies and or European studies? Because as someone who, sort of works at that divide, like I'm sort of surprised. I'm curious if you think that it shifts the scholarship in either of those, off-separated areas at all, or and then an additional question: how would you like to see this taught, either by people who work in European studies or people who work in Black studies and so forth and so on? So thank you again for the paper.
Well, I mean, crossover topics have always been interesting to me, and I would imagine the idea of trying to teach a Goethe course in a Black studies environment with this material as buttressing material to say, lots of people were interested in this and that, might actually be an interesting pedagogic approach to it. I've never tried it. I did teach a little bit in German department just as a freebie every now and then, but the students then were very much interested in Afro-Germans and the Farbe-Bekennen, that stuff was very hot for a while. But I think it might work. It might, as I said, remove the dust and get you more to, it's actually possible to read something, from a deeply remote past now and a different continent and a category. I mean, he's all that, I don't have to say, he's certainly dead, he's white, he's a man. He has lots of categories that run against him at the moment. But there is so much to be had, and people have looked for the honey in that in that comb there that now is available to you. I should also mention, Corey sent me a wonderful excerpt I didn't have time to squeeze in from the Crisis magazine, where this was a white man who goes to a Black barber and who is surprised to see that the barber, before he cut his hair, read a book about Goethe's wisdom or something, Goethe's philosophy. And so he starts talking to the barber, and you realize the guy is very smart. He knew Coleridge Taylor. He knew, a lot of things. And he said, it's so wonderful to arrive at this commonality of human beings on the basis of shared reading. Something of that recognition of the commonality. So it becomes sort of a cheery moment of a surprise recognition, when at first the guy had just said, it's a black barber, he can't, whatever, you cut my hair and shut up, was basically the attitude of the narrator. And then it's all of a sudden an eye-opening thing. And of course, we all find that sharing a reading experience or reacting to a work of art in similar ways to people who are far removed from us in so many other ways. We may be this in politics, they are something else, and they say, this is the book you must read. And you read it, say, why did he ask me to read that? And, oh, now I get it, And so this feeling of being united with another soul through a reading experience is something we have to also stimulate in our students, regardless of the categories that are so easily available about, what should be the right way and what isn't the right way to do this. Did I answer your question?
You definitely answered my question. I think that this is set. So thank you so much for this excellent presentation.